Well, welcome Scott MacKenzie. Scott MacKenzie has a long title, so I think it's easier for him to introduce himself.
Yes.
I am the Director of Corporate and External Affairs for Toyota Canada.
And Scott has a unique position because he has two hats he wears: head office of Toyota Canada, but also manufacturing. And manufacturing is going to come into play in our conversation here today about auto theft. And Andrea, you have some stats, right?
Yeah, well, every 5 minutes, a vehicle is stolen in Canada. So before we launch into what our federal government is doing to combat auto theft in Canada, I want to go back to the basics and ask, why has auto theft become such a big thing in Canada?
It's not just from a manufacturer's point of view, but even just from a seller of cars point of view, but we have a bit of a unique phenomenon. I wouldn't even say in Canada, it's largely in the Toronto-Montreal corridor. So it's a unique phenomenon, it's a bit of an ecosystem there where you've got a lot of vehicles that are in high demand and a high concentration in close proximity to exit points. In this case, it's typically the Port of Montreal. It's not only the Port of Montreal, but a lot of vehicles are being stolen quickly in the GTA, Montreal areas, and being basically put on containers and loaded into a port very quickly.
So what we hear is there's a weak point at the port that these containers are allowed to basically be put on ships and sent out of the country without much checking, and the bad guys, the organized crime, knows this, and they're taking advantage of this. So in your conversations with the government, where are these cars and trucks ending up? Do you know?
The ones that are exported out of the country through, for instance, ports, loaded on containers, sent on ships, are typically ending up in West Africa, the Middle East, and eventually in places like even Russia, just because the vehicle market in Russia is obviously very different than it was a few years ago. People aren't importing and selling cars there at the moment.
So these aren't all new vehicles. There's old vehicles that are being stolen.
By old, they're typically a couple of years old, 2 or 3 years old. You don't see a lot of 10-year-old vehicles being stolen. You also don't see many or as many brand new vehicles being stolen. It's usually late model, but vehicles that have been in the marketplace for a couple of years.
So pickup trucks are very popular, body-on-frame SUVs, and unfortunately for Toyota and Lexus, you have a high demand vehicles worldwide. You're the largest car company in the world, so I'm sure these are easy to find a market for.
Yeah, and if you look at the destinations that, again, for the ones that are being exported out of the country, if you look at the destinations where they're ending up, they're typically places that want a very durable, reliable vehicle, all-wheel drive, often SUVs. You don't see many sedans being stolen and exported overseas. You don't see many electric cars being stolen and exported overseas. There are things that you could drive very easily in those destination marketplaces.
So one thing I wanted to ask is, if you took the port out of the equation, if they could check every container, which is going to be almost impossible to do, and stop the cars leaving the country, is there a domestic auto theft market? Like if I had a car stolen, could it end up in another part of Canada? Is there much of a market for domestic theft?
Not as much. And could you have your car stolen in a place like, Edmonton or Calgary or even Vancouver? Of course, that could happen. But the rate of theft in those places is much, much lower than we're seeing in, for instance, in Ontario and Quebec. And if we compare that even to the United States, the rates of theft in Canada, the rates are basically 10 times. The actual numbers,
10 times?
Roughly, yeah.
Wow.
And the actual numbers are basically on par. It's a lot more difficult to export a car out of the United States than it is in Canada, which is one of the challenges. The rules are different, enforcement in the ports are different.
So do you have any suggestions for our viewers who have purchased a vehicle that is a high theft vehicle, popular overseas, things that they can do to protect their vehicle from being stolen?
Just be as diligent as possible. If you have a garage, park it in your garage. If you have another car that's maybe
Less desirable,
less attractive specifically to the criminals who are stealing these vehicles, park that car in front of the car. Make it harder to access the vehicle, just so it's harder to steal. Some people are using old-fashioned clubs on steering wheels, but just anything that creates a bit of a barrier or a
manual
barrier
transmission.
to
I hear.
Manual,
transmission.
Yeah, and actually the powertrains matter.
Yeah.
You're not seeing as many, for instance, hybrids or plug-in hybrids, even manual transmissions are not driven as much in those markets. So again, they're not only being stolen and exported overseas, but a large proportion of them are, and it's generally what is selling in those markets which is going to drive the activity.
So so not you, but you were part of a summit in Ottawa. The federal government convened a lot of stakeholders. Obviously, Toyota is the largest manufacturer of cars in Canada and one of the biggest sellers. You went to Ottawa. Did you have a seat at the table? Were you allowed to, as a manufacturer, to suggest things? And if so, what did you tell them in Ottawa?
Yeah, so the summit, first of all, it was a great idea. Finally pulling all of the different stakeholders together. Honestly speaking, it's a pretty complicated issue. Some people like to distill it down to a single thing, and it doesn't work that way. So you need to have everybody at the table, including government, also including, the automotive OEMs, and come up with solutions that'll work. And, I commend the government in actually pulling everybody together so that we could have that discussion. And you've seen different, policy outcomes that have come out after that, targeting things like vehicle theft devices, targeting things like, jurisdictional controls, and, trying to get everybody moving in the same direction.
And do you think the federal government is doing enough now? Are you feeling confident in the changes?
I think we're pretty appreciative that they've started moving and helping OEMs and frankly the individual consumers in this case. So I think things are moving in the right direction. Could we all be doing more? Of course, it's a complicated issue, but I'm happy with the support that we've seen most recently.
So we were at an event recently with Scott, and you mentioned something that was really quite interesting about how something can be exported from the country, and you found this out at the roundtable. Can you explain that to people, because it's a bit of a scratch your head kind of thing?
Is this the bills of lading?
Yeah, the paperwork that when you export something from the country.
Yeah, we found out recently, speaking to what I'll call legitimate vehicle exporters, like the process of exporting a vehicle in Canada versus the US is very different. And in Canada, you can load something on a shipping container, for instance, and fill out the paperwork to ship that. It's called a bill of lading, and you've got up to 48 hours after you do that to basically make changes to the customs form. So you could indicate on a customs form you're shipping A and then change it to B, and up to 48 hours after it's shipped.
So the ship has actually sailed.
It's literally on the water and it's sailed, and at that point there's not a whole lot you can do about it.
So you could say it's a container full of hammers and then change it to a Lexus or Toyota or a Honda or whatever.
Yeah, and you can change VINs, you can change information on the customs form. A lot of them are actually being found in overseas markets, and they've changed the customs form and actually put on the actual VIN of the vehicle.
Right.
As though it's being exported legally.
But that was done after the fact, after the ship had sailed.
We believe so, yeah.
Okay.
But if these thieves are re-VINning vehicles, and we talked about this briefly about having a national registry available, so that maybe if they take a VIN from British Columbia, but the vehicle was stolen in Ontario, let's say, that if it went through a national registry, maybe it would be flagged and then it wouldn't go off. But I don't know logistically how you could do a national registry.
Yeah, that's a different issue than what we've been talking about. So that's stealing cars and they're remaining in the market, so they have to exist with a VIN. So sometimes they're dead VINs, meaning they're a number that's been dormant for a while, or it's been stolen from somewhere else. And yeah, anything that would help control, I'll say the distribution or even the allocation of VINs a little bit more closely, so that you can't do that. So for instance, if you had a vehicle stolen in British Columbia and they stripped off the VIN and then used that in Ontario, it would be some way to counteract that.
Can you go through briefly some of the changes that the federal government has implemented to make things better?
Yeah, so they had quite a few funding announcements early on around, scanning equipment at the port so they can scan containers. Like, honestly, it's an incredible challenge for them. They've got a handful of people operating at the port. They've got thousands of containers going out each day. Again, it's a huge problem for them, so I commend them on the fact that they're investing in these technologies that would support. They've looked at things like I mentioned earlier around theft tools that are used and making sure that they're not available to people online.
Explain what that means, because people at home don't understand that there are tools you can order online to help steal cars.
Correct. You can order tools online on places like Amazon
Or eBay, places like
or
that.
any online marketplace. You can find them pretty easily, and they're disguised as other things. So sometimes it'll look exactly like a Game Boy. It'll look exactly like a JBL speaker, as an example, and that's not their purpose. They're used for something else. But you have to think, if something's designed to look like one thing and used for something else, doesn't that seem like it might be a little odd?
But that's whack-a-mole, I guess. If you get one, it pops up as something else, and there's a whole black market where I'm not sure how they can actually eliminate that, because as we know, with handguns, they will make it in even though they're illegal, right?
Yep. We don't have this problem in other markets like the United States. Frankly, we don't even have it in Western Canada, where we are today. But we seem to be looking at or focusing our attention on things that, will helpful, but they're not actually addressing the root cause of the problem, which is a supply and demand issue. So the vehicles, especially in southwestern Ontario and in the Montreal region, basically a portal, for lack of a better word, where you can basically move those things from one place to another relatively quickly.
So that's portal is where, the demand is always going to be there in other jurisdictions. And we have nice cars here.
Yep.
So that seems to be the link that needs to be broken. So a big part of that is in the 3-point strategy the government came out with, crackdown on these electronic devices, more policing, and more scanners at the port. The policing one is a big one because you have all of these different jurisdictions, and we've heard stories of somebody has a tracker on one of your trucks, for example, and they say, I know it's at the CP rail yard, and it's going to get shipped to Montreal and put on a ship. Why can't the local police go in there and get my truck? And that's all those walls need to come down at some point.
Yeah, there was a pretty successful operation in the Port of Montreal a couple months ago where I think it was 598 vehicles were recovered, from containers. And that largely happened because a bunch of different jurisdictions got together and, worked on basically eliminating jurisdictional or suspending jurisdictional issues for a short period of time. And they worked through an operation, found a bunch of cars. It was a tremendous success. The question is, why can't we do that all of the time?
Yeah.
Not that that's not happening, but sometimes, if a vehicle is being stolen, it can be on a container pretty quick. OEMs, not just us, but obviously I'll talk about us. We're changing technologies on vehicles all the time, and that could be very major structural changes or smaller changes, depending on what the particular issue is. But occasionally we'll go through, a full new model change, platform change. We'll change the electronic architecture on a vehicle, and that helps. But the issue is, if you focus on technology as the solution to this, you're always going to lose in the long term. And the reason why is you've got organized crime rings globally, frankly, who are taking vehicles apart, finding vulnerabilities. You're only buying time. And eventually they're going to find, and not just in our vehicles, in all vehicles, they'll find a way around it. And the other thing to mention is that if you focus on technology only, in the Greater Toronto area, there's been a rise of break-and-enters and carjacking. So if you're thinking that vehicles are too easy to steal, why are people going to the increased risk of breaking into a house or actually stopping somebody, carjacking them?
They want to get the keys,
so
they just can drive the car away.
Correct, but that's largely because it would be a lower risk proposition for them to actually steal a car out of your driveway.
Yeah.
Well, there's no possible injury if you're sleeping and they drive the car away.
It's not just injury.
Yeah.
Like the crime you're committing, if you steal a vehicle out of a driveway, it's a property crime.
I see.
You break into someone's house, you're committing a different sort of crime.
Yeah.
I understand.
But also what you're saying is that some of these new vehicles, maybe they haven't quite figured out how to steal them, which is why they're going for keys.
Correct.
Why they're being a little bit more brazen. And it's scary for people who own these vehicles. There was a report, there was a young family. He had a young child sleeping, and they were pounding on his door asking for his keys. That's scary.
There's been a belief, I guess, and it's probably true, but some vehicles are being stolen through a means called relay theft. So you're basically intercepting the signal off of a key fob. Because key fobs transmit signals.
Yeah, they send a signal and they intercept it, right?
Correct. our vehicles, and virtually every Toyota vehicle sold today and going back several years, the key fob actually has an accelerometer built into it. So it goes to sleep after 10 minutes. So if you go home and you leave your key fob and wherever you happen to leave it and you don't touch it for a while, after 10 minutes it stops transmitting a signal. The other thing just to remember is that there's still a key, and every key fob's still got a mechanical key. So you need to have a backup system to access a vehicle. So there's still a key there. It's not like it's gone away. It's just you have different electronic controls in the car that are controlled by the key fob. Like I said earlier, everybody has to do their part. OEMs, we still have to keep on improving our technologies. We're not absolving ourselves of responsibility. We need to keep on working on that, but government has a role to play. Everybody has a role to play if we're going to basically make this go in a positive direction.
Thanks so much, Scott. It was just so great to have you on the show to talk about auto theft. I know this is an important issue that many of you have asked us about, so it was great to have you on. We appreciate your time.
And by the way, this is not Scott's first time. He has been
No.
on the channel before, and I'll put a link below. We interviewed Scott and Stephen Beatty, who declined to be on the video today, about all the new stuff from Japan. So I'll link that as well. Thank you very much.
Thanks
Thank
for
you.
watching.